Hello, and welcome to this lecture on the effects of the Age of Exploration. We're going to look at what Europeans did, starting in the 1400s, and how they impacted the Western Hemisphere, North America, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, and how pretty much the entire globe was affected by Europe, and how Europe began to, for the first time, cross oceans, go out and not only explore but colonize and kind of begin the development of colonies, empires, and global trade networks that they would use to dominate the rest of the world, arguably until today, and how the system is still kind of in place. They will kind of develop and look at that trend in this class because it is not going away. It starts here and it just grows and grows and grows throughout the rest of the course. So first, before we kind of get into the effects, we're going to look at some effects, I guess, here. But I want you to know some important voyages and missions of Europeans. So you don't have to necessarily know them by heart. The one you should know is right here, of course, 1492, Columbus sailing the ocean blue across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. You should know that date. That is super important for this class. The other ones, if you know them, great. I don't think you're ever going to get a question that's like, what year did Magellan's voyage land back in Spain? You're not going to get a question like that. But knowing the progress and the process of these journeys and discovery missions, that it is kind of helpful to kind of contextualize what's going on and how Europe is viewing and treating the rest of the world. So again, Columbus isn't the first major European mission. As we can see over here, before 1492, we see several Portuguese sailors, Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama, rounding the coast of Africa. Again, they're going from Europe, skipping over the Ottomans, skipping over the Italian city-states, going around the coast of Africa and making it to the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese set up Vitorias, or these factory forts, that allowed them to kind of keep a hold on some of these areas. Again, using the new invention of gunpowder and military might, the Portuguese and then later the Dutch, who more or less steal a lot of these trading posts from the Portuguese as they become more advanced in this process. They are able to kind of establish these forts that allow them to kind of expand and strengthen their trading networks in Africa, in the Indian Ocean, and connecting back home at Europe. But the Portuguese, going back to them, are the first to really kind of skip over the trade network. They make it around Africa, and they're the first European power to kind of skip the Italians and skip the Ottomans. This gives the Portuguese a unique opportunity to get those rich, expensive Asian goods and Asian luxury goods that the European merchants and nobles craved and really highly desired. These missions got so lucrative that you can make 40, 50 plus times whatever the cost of the mission was. You could really make your money back if everyone survived and the ship survived and no looting or stealing happened. You can make your money back pretty easily, and make a nice profit on top of that. So the Portuguese are doing this in the 1480s, 1490s. Then when we get to the Spanish, who are now, centralized under Ferdinand and Isabella, or I should say Isabella and Ferdinand, they want to kind of go in that same direction and get their own, Asian market access. So we see the Spanish looking for a sailor or ships that can go out and access these Asian goods. And we see an Italian sailor, Christopher Columbus, who's from Genoa, the Italian city-state of Genoa. He meets this moment and is, wins the contest to charter this voyage to Asia, and he doesn't want to go around Africa like the Portuguese were doing. He believes, and people around him believe, that you can sail across the ocean from Europe to Asia. and you'll make your way to Japan or Indonesia or India or some place like that, and access the Asian trading network that way, because they didn't believe there was, North and South America right there. So this mission goes. They sail across the Atlantic again, thinking they're going to land in Japan or India or something like that. And Columbus did believe he landed there. It wasn't for some years that Europeans began to realize this was not Asia that they had landed in, that it was actually a new land, a new continent. It takes them some decades to kind of come to that realization. But Columbus does land here. He claims it for Spain, immediately comments on how the natives looked very easily defeatable and could be enslaved very easily. And that process begins, is the birth of the Spanish Empire and domination of the New World. Unlike the Portuguese, who wanted to set up forts and trading posts in India, Africa, and Asia, etc., the Spanish really wanted to eventually set up colonies and empires. And they're the first to kind of really lead that charge in 1492. Other voyages of note, Spain also is the first nation to kind of claim the first circumnavigation of the globe. We see a Portuguese sailor, Ferdinand Magellan, who is sailing for Spain, not Portugal, sail around the globe, making their way through the southern tip of South America, through the Pacific, which is a big body of water, which is very tough to sail across. The voyage survives. Unfortunately, maybe fortunately, depending on how you feel about Magellan, he is killed in the Philippines when he tries to lead a violent conversion of the indigenous people in the Philippines, then sails through Indonesia, through the Indian Ocean, and the crew makes it back home in Spain a few years later, 3 years later, as a matter of fact. I think a number of ships were lost. Most of the crew died or abandoned ship or mutinied and sailed away. I think you have over 100, if not more, sailors deserting, with only 22 maybe returning being on the ship that returned home. So it was a very disastrous journey, but they did make it around, even though Magellan himself did not survive the voyage. Didn't even make it. Maybe made it halfway, but I don't know if he made it farther than that. Last big journey you should know is another Portuguese journey, Pedro Alvarez Cabral. He not only sailed around Africa and helped get a more efficient journey to India. He helped with that process. He also, quote unquote, discovered Brazil for Portugal, and this helped the Portuguese kind of establish their own empire that's going to last until the 1800s, and that's mostly Brazil. Again, the Portuguese don't really have a substantial empire. They, again, favor trading posts. The exception to that is Brazil, and that kind of sets in motion some of the awful, evil things we're going to see by the Europeans and the Portuguese in the next couple of centuries. So here you can kind of see how things develop as far as the first age of exploration. Again, I kind of hinted at this in the last lecture. You really want to separate this age of exploration from the later age of exploration that we see in the 1800s, specifically the 1850 to 1914. There's different motives there, there's different actions there, different prerogatives there. Here it's the 3 Gs: God, Glory, Gold. We do see some of those ideas develop that's going to inspire the 1800s, age of imperialism. We see racism develop. We see cultural superiority develop by the Europeans. And we see technological superiority develop by the Europeans against the rest of the world. But this is mostly a money-making venture, which is supported by economic motives. Again, you could say God, glory, or gold. God, glory, or gold are the most important factors in pushing this age of colonization. But it's going to be different from what we're going to see in the 1800s. One gigantic effect. Again, this does not happen overnight. This happens over decades, centuries, arguably, is the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange was a long-term process in the transference of animals, plants, germs, and people between the Old World, or Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the New World, North, Central, and South America. Again, these two landmasses were connected by, maybe a land bridge tens of thousands, if not more, not many more years ago, but that has gone away. So you kind of have, over the years, you have two different ecosystems develop in the Americas and in the Old World. And when the Europeans journey to the Americas, they bring with them over time these plants, animals, germs, and people that then inhabit the New World. And then we see an exchange happen again with plants, animals, people, germs coming from the New World, or the Western Hemisphere, to the Old World. So this happened over many, many years. It was not overnight, and it does change both. It changed the world fundamentally. Look at a few examples of these. It's good to know a few examples, right? Potatoes, you cannot overlook potatoes. They come from the New World, made their way to the Old World. You also have sweet potatoes, cassava, going to, these areas as well. But just looking at Europe, since, we are studying Europe in this AP Euro class, the potato fundamentally changed Europe. It's very easy to grow. You can grow it anywhere. It's very easy to make more potatoes. You just cut off a piece of the potato you currently have, throw it in the mud, and it'll eventually probably grow. You can do this over and over again very easily. You can grow the potato anywhere. Not only that, it is very nutritious. The carbs and the other nutrients that are in a potato are just so much more substantial than what you find in some bread, especially the poor quality bread that a lot of poor Europeans had access to at this time. The potato making its way to Europe, game changer. That's why when the Irish have their potato their potato crop go bad in the 1800s, it was so devastating. All that nutrition went out the window, and the Irish suffered because of that. Not also because of the British and their imperial colonization of Ireland, but that's another story we'll talk about next semester. But here again, you can't underlook or overlook the potato. Another example, the tomato. The tomato making its way from the New World to the Old World, making its way to Italy. Can you think of an Italian cuisine without the tomato, without pizza, without pasta, without all of those things, without all that food you'd find? It's a total game changer. Looking at the other way, we see big influences the other way. We see sugar, which was grown in Southeast Asia, in very, very, very warm climates. Some European along the way saw that you could take sugarcane and transport it to the Caribbean and to South America and to Brazil, and that's where it grew and grew and grew. We see, unfortunately, enslaved Africans taken over, stolen out of Africa, taken to South America, taken to the Caribbean, forced to work on these sugarcane plantations, and we see eventually a gigantic sugar economy develop in these regions. And who wants to buy that sugar? Europeans. So we see a big chain reaction that just changed the lives of tons and tons and tons of people. We see germs spread across the ocean too. All of these diseases, smallpox being the main one, they were not really present in the Americas. So when you're sick Europeans, or just dirty Europeans that had some smallpox germs on them, when they brought those germs over to the New World, devastating for the indigenous Americans there. Most indigenous Americans were wiped out by disease, warfare, conquest. Exhaustion were reasons why indigenous Americans were killed. Number one thing is smallpox, though, and it wasn't necessarily intentional. We don't really see the first evidence of intentional germ warfare until like the 1700s with, I believe during the 7 Years' War, some Europeans get the idea to bring some smallpox blankets to some indigenous fort or something like that. It's kind of hazy and murky if that's how accurate that is. Most of this was done unintentionally, though. Nevertheless, you can't overlook it. 90 plus of indigenous life was just wiped out by Europeans coming over and spreading their germs unintentionally to an indigenous population. Slavery in that process was 100% intentional and violent, but the extermination of indigenous Americans, at least until the 1700s. At least when we look at germ warfare, that was not intentional. Now, don't get me wrong, Europeans did go over, intentionally murder, destroy, enslave indigenous Americans. That was 100% intentional, and violent and wrong, in the eyes of modern society. But germ warfare was not. It was not intentional, at least because Europeans didn't know what a germ was until the 1800s for the most part. They had no idea, that germs can cause all these problems. Anyway, make sure you know some of these major exchanges that happened between the New World and the Old World. Just knowing a few examples is good. The potato, the tomato, chocolate, sugar, coffee, fundamentally changes life on both sides of the Atlantic and throughout the rest of the world. Other effects, I've talked about this a little bit, but we see just the widespread wiping out of indigenous Americans. Why did they wipe out? Why did they get wiped out? How did they get wiped out? Like I said, disease was the #1 killer of Native Americans in North, Central, and South America, no question. Of course, Europeans were violent, awful, and horrendous towards the indigenous Americans, no question there. Military conquest was a thing, enslavement was a thing, but the #1 killer of indigenous Americans was smallpox and similar diseases. Europeans had immunity to these diseases because they grew up and were born around them. If they weren't strong enough, they would die off. Europeans don't have the longest lifespan. Native Americans had zero immunity, zero protection from these diseases. There's no such thing as a vaccine or inoculation. Yet there's really no such thing as medicine or modern medicine, definitely at this point in time. So any contact that these indigenous Americans had with disease was disastrous and deadly right away. The conquistadors were particularly violent towards the indigenous Americans. We see, conquistadors and other explorers playing different groups of indigenous people off one another, fighting back and forth. For example, when you look at Hernan Cortez and his conquest of the Aztecs, first of all, he snuck away illegally from the Caribbean to Central America, to Mexico, to look for adventure, look for glory. When he landed in Central America, he found these different groups of indigenous Americans that hated the Aztecs. The Aztecs used human sacrifice and really just dominated smaller nations and tribes that surrounded their gigantic empire. And Hernan Cortez took advantage of this. He got these different groups together, invaded the capital, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, and very, very quickly, using fear, weapons, and things like that, was able to outmaneuver and conquer the gigantic empire, which had a gigantic population. Tenochtitlan, which is now known as Mexico City, had a population that was very similar to London or Paris. I think it even dwarfed both of those two in terms of population at the time. But it was very easy to take advantage of infighting. And the Incan Empire, which again was gigantic, when we see, I believe, Pizarro go down there to the Andes Mountain in western South America, same thing. The different Incan groups had just fought a civil war. They had a new leader who was relatively weak. When the Spanish go in, they're able to kind of use that infighting and that process to kind of take advantage of that situation and easily conquer the Inca, and lie to them, cheat them, and steal them out of their land, and again establish empires. Because the Spanish does this, they kind of get this reputation that's known as the Black Legend. It's called the Black Legend because, and it's given to them by the British and the Dutch. It's basically this trend of Europeans talking about and spreading stories of just Spanish cruelty. And the Spanish did talk about this to an extent. You have people like Bartolome de las Casas, who you might remember from APUSH or maybe 8th grade, who just wrote about just the awful mistreatment of indigenous people by the Spanish and just how they were worked to death, treated like cattle and just abused. This spreads in certain European communities, inside European courts, and we see people talk about just how awful the Spanish were towards indigenous people. And a part of it's true. You do see this awful mistreatment of them. The part that is not true is that the British and the Dutch made it seem like only the Spanish did this, when in fact the British and the Dutch and the Portuguese all did this. No one was nice to the natives, except for the French in some cases. Most of the Europeans were just awful towards the indigenous Americans. The French, once they get around to colonizing and things like that, they're a little bit different. They saw the indigenous people more as business partners and in many cases marriage partners. It wasn't always, a positive, beneficial relationship for both sides, but it wasn't the outright conquest and violence that you saw with the Spanish or the British or the Dutch colonization. Inside these Spanish colonies, we see the encomienda system develop, which has kind of two meanings. The first meaning is that, you see a social hierarchy established with slaves and indigenous Americans on the bottom, mixed people in the middle, Europeans born in the New World right below the top, and then peninsulares or Europeans born in Europe that then came over to the New World on the very top of the social hierarchy. Creoles are going to be really important when we get to the 1800s because they're going to be European but not have all the rights of a European, so they're going to want to fight for that. Kind of along the lines of what we saw with Americans wanting to do in the American Revolution, the rights of the Englishmen, etc. But this system is established by the Spanish, but it also, the encomienda also refers to control of land and labor. In the New World, these empires were set up, these pieces of land were set up in which the Spanish controlled labor, forced indigenous Americans to work, and when that failed because indigenous people, A, died, or B, ran away, or C, just didn't really fulfill their part of the forced labor system they are a part of, we see African natives taken in, enslaved, and put to work on the system. Again, this encomienda system really only exists with Spain and the Spanish Empire that's being established in the New World. It is not widespread amongst other European nations, including Portugal, which again preferred trading posts. Conversion was a goal of this system, but like I said last lecture, you can't always enslave a Christian. So sometimes, and many times, Christian conversion was avoided in some cases because you couldn't really abuse and neglect these people, and if you did, you'd be called out on it, just like Bartolomé de las Casas did. Outside of the Western Hemisphere, outside of the Americas, we see indigenous people mistreated as well. People in Africa, people in Asia, especially as racism and racial identity becomes a thing. As this class goes on, that's going to become more and more of a thing. You're going to see Europeans think of themselves in a better regard and a better light than the rest of Europe, and that's going to contribute to these systems of violence and discrimination that we're going to see develop throughout the globe. Going along with that idea, another big effect of the age of exploration is the Atlantic slave trade. Incredibly violent system that was developed by the Portuguese first, and then kind of followed by the Dutch, the French, the Danish, the British. The Spanish played a part in this. Pretty much all of Europe plays a part in the slave trade. Pretty much all of Europe, especially Western Europe, owns slaves and is a part of the slave trade. We see the first slaves brought to Portugal in the 1500s as prisoners of war. And this is kind of the common beginning of things. We see these people used as servants. You can look at lots of European paintings from this period, and it was kind of a touch of your wealth or a mention of your nobility if you were able to get a portrait of yourself with a black servant or a black maid or someone who had a darker complexion working in your household or serving you. That was a sign of wealth, importance, and notoriety. As years go on, as things go on, and we see the Columbian Exchange go into full swing, we don't really see as many slaves brought to Europe. We see a lot more of these slaves in Africa brought to the New World, particularly the Caribbean and Brazil. Why? Like I said, sugarcane, which comes from, South Asia, Southeast Asia, only can grow in a tropical climate under very, very, very tough situations, which I'll talk about in a second. That is brought to the Caribbean, that is brought to Brazil, and we see gigantic sugarcane plantations established. Now, who can work these plantations? The indigenous Americans are dying out due to disease, so the Europeans turn to African slave labor. They take enslaved people from Africa, who were taken, stolen, purchased from different African locations, brought to Central and South America, and put to work on these brutal sugarcane plantations. Now, how is this brutal? This is so brutal because you have to work in these hot, humid, tropical climates. And again, the world's hot today with, the way things are going, but going to the Caribbean and Brazil, working these jungle climates for hours a day, under the sun, sweating all day, it's just devastating. And again, this is in the 1500s, the 1600s. There's no, easy to access restrooms or water, things like that. You're working in the wilderness in these awful conditions under the sun without any modern conveniences. So the enslaved people are taken out of Africa into the Caribbean, into the Brazil, and just put to work, harvesting sugarcane. That process is also pretty brutal. It's not easy to cut down sugarcane. You got to use a sharp machete, and you got to cut through these gigantic stalks and cut through them. And you then have to harvest them pretty quickly. You cannot leave sugarcane out because it'll rot pretty quickly. You have to grind it up, and it'll eventually turn into the sugar product that we're all aware of. The thing is, again, we're in the 1600s. There's no machine that can easily do this. So this is done using ancient, archaic machinery, which is very easy to break and not very efficient. So you put the sugarcane stalk in the machine, you grind it up by hand, but it's very easy to get stuck because it's sticky. There's other things going on with it, so it very easily jammed. How do you unjam it? You got to stick your hand in there. You got to get a tool or something to poke at it and unclog it. Problem is, it's very easy to get. It can sometimes break free, and you can get your arm stuck in there. And then guess what? You lose your arm. And there's no modern medicine. There's no modern surgery. So it's probably a death sentence. The average lifespan of the average enslaved African who was working in these sugarcane plantations was about 5 years. You had about 5 years after you crossed the Atlantic Ocean, if you survived that arduous process, which I'll talk about in a second. You had about 5 years on average of surviving in the New World. It was very horrendous. That process too, which again is called the Middle Passage, which is separate from the whole sugarcane plantation process. That process of crossing the ocean is arduous and horrific as well. In Africa, slaves were captured. Again, like I said at first, prisoners of war, but as the Portuguese and other Europeans got more and more into Africa, they just started taking anyone. Africans called this out. One example was the Christian king. Important note, he's Christian, King Afonso I, who at first made a deal with the Portuguese, but eventually, as you can see in this quote here, just called it out and said, you guys are just stealing anyone left and right. This is corrupt. This is horrible. You're depopulating our nation. You need to stop it. Of course, the Portuguese did not listen. No one else listened either, as far as the Europeans go. And this process just continued and continued and continued until the 1800s. But if you were unfortunately stuck in the system, if you were unfortunately an African person who was captured by the Europeans or whoever, you were captured and put on a ship, and you were transported across the Atlantic in a process called the Middle Passage. Over 10% of people in the Middle Passage died. You'd have a 100-day journey chained to the bottom of a ship. below deck. There were instances of suicide. There were instances of murder and death and disease. It was very common to lose your life across this voyage. Again, you didn't have the best chance of surviving the voyage. Once you made it across the ocean, if you did survive, you were auctioned off to a plantation, most likely in Central or South America or in the Caribbean. Of course, some slaves did make it to North America and the English colonies, but I believe 95% of the slaves that were taken across the ocean landed in the Caribbean or in Brazil to work in those awful, horrendous sugarcane plantations. Of course, the plantations in the Americas were awful too, but you did have a higher survival rate working in the Carolinas or something like that. This process was so deadly and so arduous and so awful that it was cheaper for European sugarcane planters to just purchase a new slave off the boat rather than actually care for and give a good life to the slave that they purchased. It was just cheaper just to buy the next person that was coming off the ship. And again, Europeans need to rationalize this. Why are they doing this awful system? They can't just say it's to make money and to sell sugar in Europe, which becomes a more and more lucrative process over time as sugar gets more and more demand in Europe by the 1700s. So they develop and strengthen racist ideas. These people of Africa, they would say, deserve to be enslaved, deserve to have this awful system thrust upon them. One last point here, we're going to see the development of something called the triangle trade, which is between Europe, Africa, and the New World, which, kind of makes the shape of a triangle. Slaves would be taken from Africa to the New World, again, mostly the Caribbean or Brazil, where they'd work and work and work in sugarcane plantations. That sugar, you could break into colonies if you wanted, but that sugar would be taken to the colonies, but a lot of the time to Europe, where that sugar or other trade goods would be made into things like molasses or alcohol, etc. That would then be taken to Africa, sold to the people of Africa in exchange for more slaves. So this process is very mercantilist. Again, Europe's controlling the final product. They get the final outcome. They get the work from the enslaved person. They get the lucrative alcohol or molasses that they can then sell and get more money for their business, for their nation, and strengthen their economy. Actually, I lied. There's one more point I want to talk about. Like I said, this goes on for centuries, from the 1500s. Actually, it starts in the 1400s up until the 1800s. So 400-ish years this goes on. The right to do this is called the asiento. This becomes an important trading point for the Europeans. We see, again, different European nations control the slave trade, which again is called the asiento, but it wasn't always the Portuguese. It goes to the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, the British, the Danish. And the British did the most trading of all, by the way. They traded over 6 million enslaved Africans, which is over, it was about half of all enslaved people that were taken from Africa and brought to the New World. But this process becomes like a bargaining chip. You fight a war with a nation, let's say you're the Dutch, and you go to war with the British and you lose. The British maybe will ask for the asiento in trade and peace negotiations. You're the Portuguese, you fight the French beat you. Maybe you're the Portuguese, you have the asiento, maybe the French could ask for it. So it kind of became a bargaining chip that different European powers could use to kind of gain leverage, gain economic power over each other. Couple notes, couple effects on this, and this will kind of lead us into our next lecture and our last lecture for this unit, and it's notes on the global economy. Again, why didn't Italy join in on this process? Like I said last time, and like I repeat again, the Italians were the dominant trading area for hundreds of years. Maybe not that long, but definitely for 100 years prior to the beginning of this class, we see the Italian city-states, the dominant city-states that kind of controlled trade. There is the Hanseatic League, I don't want to ignore them. But when it comes to getting Asian goods and lucrative Asian goods and making tons of money off of the Asian trade network, the Indian Ocean trade network, the Italians were the area to beat. They were the group of city-states to beat. Why did they lose? Well, number one, the Ottomans kind of conquer Constantinople in 1453. That causes the price of spice to increase, and that slowly begins to eat away at Italian profits and the Italian trade that the Italians had with Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Italy's also kind of blocked. You have the Ottomans blocking you over here. The Italians and the Ottomans were not friends. Again, difference of religion, and most of Europe viewed the Ottomans as barbarians that destroyed the Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. Same thing at this point in time. And they're also kind of blocked by Morocco, Spain, and Portugal in the west. So the Ottomans blocked them over here. The Spanish and the Portuguese blocked them over here. They have no way to get out. That's why you see people like Christopher Columbus, who's Genoese, who's Italian. He sails for Spain because Spain can geographically escape Europe. Italy had a much tougher time with that. There's no unification. Spain, France, Britain have a new monarch. They centralize, they unify, not like to the full extent that they are today, but they begin that process, which lasts for centuries. Italy doesn't unify until the 1860s, 1870s, and even then, it's still kind of a mess. We'll talk about that in Unit 7 this year. But these they fought each other. They fought each other, competed with each other. They did their own training and things like that, but they just didn't care too much about it. They had money. They preferred to have some rich merchant families kind of develop, and then they would kind of do their business within Europe. They didn't really look at exploration outside of the Mediterranean as something it's too important. Spain and Portugal, and then later France, Britain, and the British and the Dutch, they had no choice when it comes to exploration. They had to get around this Italian network and this Ottoman blockage and see what else was out there, see other ways to get to Asia. And that's why you kind of see the Portuguese and the Spanish and then everyone else kind of go this route when it comes to exploration and navigation. I want to talk about two more things. The first, global trade network, and the influence of religion here too. Like I said, the Portuguese, they prefer to establish forts called Vitórias around the globe. We see them here in Brazil, the coast of Africa, India, and in Indonesia, in that region. This is in history. This gets credit for being the first global trade network. They have trade networks and trading posts in Europe, the Americas, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, and you have the whole globe for the first time in history connected by a trade network. You could buy goods from East Asia and sell them in Europe for the first time, or sell them along any stop in this trading network. That's notable. They don't get to keep it. The Dutch and then the Spanish and the British eventually take it over, but the Portuguese do get that goalpost for kind of establishing the first global trade network. And again, it's built on violence, it's built on exploitation of indigenous people and stolen Africans, but it is the first network that we do see set up across the world. So that is kind of an interesting development. We do see again Catholicism play a role here. Again, 3Gs, God, Glory, Gold. We do see the Pope and the Church kind of, play a part in this, not just, through the monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabella, but through the Pope actually making a treaty between Spain and Portugal with the Treaty of Tordesillas. With Portugal kind of making an inroads in South America, this angered Spain, so these two strong Catholic nations went to the Pope and said, how should we divide up this new land that they're eventually realized is not Asia, but a new world, a Western Hemisphere. So the Pope divides this new world with the Treaty of Tordesillas in the line of demarcation, saying anything to the west of the line belongs to Spain, anything to the east of the line belongs to Portugal, which is where we see Portugal get Brazil, and we see Spain get, a gigantic empire that spans from, California all the way to South America and the Caribbean. So that's kind of how that is developed. The first line is called the line of demarcation, and then the Treaty of Tordesillas gives Portugal a little bit more land there. This wasn't always followed. For example, we do see Portugal kind of, get territory over here from Japan and Indonesia, Africa, and Europe. The Spanish, for example, get the Philippines, which doesn't always follow that. So these lines aren't like set in stone, but we do see the church kind of play a secular role in kind of dividing up this Catholic empire. Of course, next year we'll talk about how not everyone was Catholic in Europe after 1517. So we're going to see, Protestant or non-Catholic nations like the Dutch, like the English, ignore this line because they don't follow the Pope. They don't care what these Catholic powers have to do, especially when you look at, again, the Spanish Black Legend. Why would anyone want to listen to this awful, awful empire and how they treat people awfully? So that plays a role as well. All right, that's it for this lecture. Next unit, we'll talk more about economics and how this period of exploration really started a new revolution called the Commercial Revolution, which changes the economy, the business of Europe, and how that kind of trickles and leads us into the rest of the class. So I'll see you next time.